Hi there, Lindsay here, the Frugal Crafter. Today we're going to make some fun bookmarks using some supplies from our sponsor Top Flight Stamps. These are the cute new Alice in Wonderland stamps from Visible Image, and the cool thing about Top Flight Stamps is they bring the coolest stamps and stencils and other supplies from all over the world to us here in the United States. So companies you might not have heard of before, they have. So check them out. There'll also be a coupon code in the video description to save an additional 10% on your order, and USA orders over 50 ship free. So there's a lot of savings to be had at topflightstamps.com. There are other characters available in this line of stamps like the Cheshire Cat, the White Rabbit, and of course Alice herself, and those are all in stock, at least at the time I'm recording this video, so make sure you check them out if you want to grab them because they usually sell out pretty quickly when they get some new products in. So what I'm doing here is stamping all of these characters with black Memento ink. I'm using Memento because I plan on coloring with my alcohol pens. You always want to make sure that you use the proper ink for the medium that you're going to be coloring with so it doesn't bleed, feather, or smudge. The caterpillar stamp actually came with this really big toadstool, which I thought was really nice that it came as two different stamps because then you could use a mushroom on its own and you could use a caterpillar on its own, but I wanted to have the caterpillar sitting on the mushroom, so I needed to make a mask. So to do this, all you need to do is stamp your image again on a post-it note or a scrap of paper. Post-it notes are nice because that little bit of adhesive on the back will keep them in place while you're stamping, and then you simply want to cut out your post-it note. Cut fairly closely or even go into the design. Like if I'm stamping, I'll even cut on the black stamped line because it's better just to have it a smidgen too small so you don't end up with a gap when you go to stamp your other item on top. Now I didn't get fussy and cut in between the lines on his pipe. I can always fill that in with a black pen later if I need to. So once you stamp your next image on top, it's going to look like the image you stamped first is in front or on top of the object and the other object is underneath. Then I simply keep my mask right in the bag where I keep my stamps at so that I'll have it next time and I won't have to recut the mask. Do it once and save some time. Then I went ahead and I stamped all the other characters that I intended to color on this cardstock. This cardstock is the Nina Classic Crest Solar White 80-pound cardstock. I know you can find Nina cardstock at Walmart and Target, but that's not the stuff that's really great for your alcohol markers. The cardstock you want is the Classic Crest, so make sure you look at that. Look for that. I buy the 80-pound because I just use it for coloring stamped images, but it also comes in 110-pound, and if you wanted an all-purpose cardstock that you could use for both card bases and stamping layers, you could go for that. I usually get a cheaper heavyweight cardstock for my card bases though, but to each their own. If you only want to have one cardstock and that will do the trick, that will work. Now when I'm doing Tweedledee and Tweedledum, instead of masking the hat, stamping the hat first and masking, I thought it would be easier to stamp my my guy and either wipe off the ink at the top of the head for stamping, or like I'm doing here, I'm actually going to wipe off the top of the head and the face because there's several little faces you can stamp in Tweedledee and Tweedledum, and that way I could have them looking different directions. So that's a great way that you can make your stamps more useful, even if you don't have a set like this that has those options. So now that I've left that gap for the hat, I can go ahead and stamp in the D hat and the dumb hat on top. Now, I'm going to tell you a little time-saving tip that I used. I used my Scan and Cut to cut out all of these images. Because I don't have matching dies, I don't even think there are matching dies for these, I decided that I would just use my Scan and Cut to cut it. So there's a couple things to keep in mind. If you see that gap on the hat of Tweedledee there, I need to go in and fill that gap with a black pen or the Scan and Cut is not going to recognize it. The other thing to keep in mind, if you know you're going to cut it out using a machine, like a Scan and Cut machine, I'm not talking about dies or scissors, is that you need to be neat about your coloring, because if I make a dark mark, I get lazy with my coloring, like if I was cutting it out by hand, the Scan and Cut would cut around all those mistakes. So since I know that I'm using that machine to cut, I've got to color really neatly on these. A question I get asked quite a bit is whether or not I can mix my markers, and absolutely, all your alcohol pens will work with other alcohol pens, and something I like to do is even take in an acrylic paint pen and add some opaque details to my coloring, such as if I need a highlight on the hair, like with the white, or maybe if my ink bled into the white of the eyes, I could bring the white of the eyes back with my white. If you find you're coloring with an acrylic paint pen and it's not opaque looking, what you might need to do is cap it up and shake it and then recolor. Another thing that you might need to do when you're working with alcohol pens is let them dry completely before you go over them with a paint pen, because sometimes it just wants to absorb into the paper if your ink is still wet. Even though it doesn't feel wet to the touch, that alcohol ink stays wet for quite a while on your paper. That's why you can go in and shade and blend so easily without streaks. It's because it's sitting in that paper and it's staying wet for a while. So here you can see all my guys all colored and cut out. Don't worry about those white spaces that are in like the Mad Hatter's arm and the caterpillar's pipe cord. Because I'm going to show you how you can deal with that when we come to our crafting stage and we're putting everything together. I'm using some shipping tags that I bought in bulk from Paper Mart, and I am just direct inking them with my Distress Oxide inks. I like to use the Distress Oxide inks kind of like a paint because they're thick and opaque. They work really great for these techniques. I'm not a fussy stamper. I don't spend a lot of time, making seamless blends. I want to just lay down some color because I know by the time I'm done with all the techniques I'm going to do, having a seamless blend in the background really isn't important. You're not going to see all that handiwork. So I'm keeping it a little bit quicker and just doing some direct inking. Also, I find that if I'm working on a paper that's not specifically made or sized for Distress Oxide ink, is that it absorbs a little quicker and dries quicker. So you really need a lot more ink on those papers to get the effects. Now, I picked up this little watercolor set this weekend at this cute little green store in Belfast, and I just fell in love with a tin. I figured the paints were probably going to be chalky and yucky, but I just loved the tin so much I couldn't help myself. But then I started, because I did do a few little paintings with that set. It was totally chalky, but then I had a brainstorm. I thought, you know what? This would be ideal to use to flick on paints on top of my Distress Oxide inks, because that way I don't have to use more of my ink. I don't need to press that out on a block and wet it and flick it. This paint looks like Distress Oxide because it's so chalky. So I'm using that with my inks to save on my ink and also get use from something that really I wouldn't use for painting because it is too chalky. And I'll have that used up so I can reuse that tin for something else in no time. The reason I chose Distress Oxide inks for this project is the fact that they're kind of opaque. I wouldn't call them completely opaque, but they are fairly opaque, definitely as far as inks go, so I can layer on images and still keep some of that vibrancy. I like to grab different stencils and kind of mix and match them, grab different inks that I've been using, so I keep recycling the colors, and I love to just flick on plain water and then blot it off to get that oxidized effect, which Distress ink is known for. I tried a few different characters in front of this background to see what was going to fit best, and I really liked the way the Mad Hatter went, so I knew I needed a little more contrast because he didn't stand out as much as I wanted to, and I spent some serious time coloring, and I really wanted to make sure it showed up. So I blotted it with some black Distress Oxide, flicked on some water, and blotted off the water spots for texture, and then I took a black marker and filled in the spot inside the arm so that it would kind of look like that black background. That way you'd never know that that part wasn't cut out. I don't know if there's a way to cut out inside areas with a scan and cut, but I haven't figured it out yet. I stay pretty basic with that machine, so I figured using that marker trick was the perfect solution for me. It was quick, cheap, and easy. Here's a tip for glue. If you need a fine tip applicator or glue bottle but you don't have one, use a needle tool to apply any wet glue to the back of your tiny die cuts and it will work just as well as a fine tip glue bottle. And you can do this when your fine tip glue bottle pin breaks and then you can't use your fine tip anymore. So don't throw the glue away, you can totally reuse it. Now here I'm stamping this ha 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 stamp in the background, and it didn't stamp great because I didn't have my stamping mat, so I took a black pen and filled in my ha-has, and then it looks good now. I inked the edges and I just think that gives you a nice little frame and makes everything kind of pull together. Now before I was telling you about white pens and letting your alcohol ink dry really well before you go over them. Now that this has had plenty of time to dry, you can see I'm getting a much bolder highlight on the Mad Hatter's hat than I did on the Queen's hair. It's just because the ink had plenty of time to dry. Now I'm debating about what sort of other stamps I might want to use, and I really love these kind of like paper cutout words. They kind of partially remind me of an art journal, they partially remind me of a ransom note, and I just think it's really fun and quirky and works really well with the style of illustration that's on these stamps. Now I'm going to do the same trick here with this caterpillar and the spot there in between the pipe cord, and I'm just using a couple different shades of blue blue and green and some clear blender, and look at that. It looks like it was cut out. So it's such a handy trick whenever you don't want to fussy cut those innards. You can just try to make it match your background as best you can, especially with a mixed media background like we're doing here. It's so splotchy as it is. You can totally wing it and make it look like it belongs. I don't like that. The white is really going to be powerful and draw your eyes in. That's why it's so nice to use on the sentiments or for a highlight. So you don't want it where you don't want to be drawing in extra attention. Now there I made a mistake. I glued down my caterpillar and I realized I did not have enough contrast. So I'm using my handy dandy watercolor set and I am just kind of dabbing in and spattering in some black to give him a little contrast so he will stand out from the background. So you know what? Those were super inexpensive watercolors. I'm sure you have something at home that will work. If you don't have distress ink pads or distress oxide inks, use what you have. Look at your art supplies. Do you have watercolors? Do you have acrylic paints? Do you have something else that will do the trick? And you'll probably like it more because it will be completely unique and totally you. And there I used the words from that kit and I thought it looked really nice. And I'm going ahead and inking the edges. But I'll give you a tip. You don't really need to ink your edges now if you don't want to, because when we're all done, we're going to ink them again. So that's kind of redundant. I didn't realize I'd need to ink them again after I was done, but you'll see that when we get to it. I really love stencils for their versatility. When you're using stencils with distress ink though, I just want to let you know you will need to clean them. Oftentimes I won't clean my stencils if I've used like alcohol ink or acrylic paint because it dries and it doesn't reactivate very easily. But this distress inks they'll get on other stencils where you store them, they'll make a mess. So you definitely want to spritz them with water and wipe them with a rag so that they don't bother you. Now another cool way to use stencils with the distress ink is simply to spritz water over them, and then you can blot off the water. It leaves that really faint image behind, and it's just a nice way to add another layer of texture. You're probably not going to see it that much if you're doing a lot of layering, but all those little layers and bits of texture do add up to give you some a richness in your design, to give you those beautiful layers that you love as in mixed media. Now instead of smudging black, I used a fairly tight stencil with a kind of all over design. It was by it's from topflightstamps.com, and I will list the maker in the video description because it's escaping my brain right now. And then I just glued down these two. They're pretty much the same design, so I don't need to go over that too much more. Now what I'm going to do is back these tags with some pattern papers from my scraps, and what I do is I sort all of my paper scraps by color in a hanging file folder system. So I just grabbed paper that would work. I figured no need to cut into fresh sheets of paper for this because the scraps are perfect. So I just glued them down really well. Just try to make sure you get some adhesive around the edge, and then you're going to trim them fairly closely. Don't freak out if you get a little sliver of that background paper showing through. You don't want like that's a little wide, but like if you just have a little sliver of white on the edge, don't worry, because that's when what I mentioned about the second inking. We're going to ink those edges again so that you're not going to see that. So you just trim it as close as you can. By the way, this cutter is an X-Acto brand guillotine style cutter that I purchased for $24 over 20 years ago at Staples, in case you're wondering. After you've got it cut out with the cutter, just go with your scissors and you can trim off any of those little corner bits or any pieces that didn't cut out very well. But if you just have a little white sliver on the side, just ink it up with your Distress Oxide inks and a sponge dauber, and that will make it look nice and neat and give you a pretty frame, and you won't notice if you have any little bits of paper sticking out from your background paper. And then just go through and punch holes where the shipping tags holes were so it goes through your background paper. Now it's time to laminate. You could use packing tape or crystal clear contact paper, but I'm going to use my heat laminator because I have it. Just make sure your tags are completely dry so you don't trap steam in the laminating pouch, and I just use the 8.5 by 11 inch pouches because they're the most convenient and easy to find, and then just run it through my laminator. I can get about 3 per pouch. Then I trim it closely, and if I notice that something has not sealed properly on the edges, I just run it right through the laminator again. You can do that a few times if you need to make sure that your lamination film clings really strongly to your paper so you get a nice crystal clear, bright effect. If it looks a little hazy, you probably could send it through the machine again. After that, I'm using my crocodile and some shaped eyelets that I've had forever, some hearts and stars, to attach the little tassels. And the smaller tassels are from Paper Mart. The bigger ones were from About Art Accents. I'm not sure if they're still their website's still in business anymore, but you can make your own tassels or use ribbons or fibers or whatever you have handy. It all looks really great. So use whatever you have and make it your own, because that's the fun thing about crafting. You can make it your own, completely unique and original, just based on what you have for supplies at home. So you could take these ideas and apply it to other supplies, other stamps, other materials, and just have a lot of fun. I love to make bookmarks because I like to read, and it's always nice to have a handmade bookmark in your book. I want to thank you so much for watching today. If you'd like to find these materials I used, check out our sponsor, topflightstamps.com. I'll have links to everything I used today, as well as a coupon code in the video description. Thanks so much for watching. Until next time, happy crafting.